Welcome to this journey through one of the most devastating betrayals in American industrial history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will shake your understanding of corporate power and human dignity in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a tragedy that consumed an entire community, where the promise of prosperity became a death sentence, and where men, women, and children paid with their lives for a legacy so poisoned that the very earth beneath their feet became their tomb. It was the year 1924. America was roaring through the Jazz Age. Prosperity seemed limitless, and industrial titans were building empires on the backs of immigrant labor. In Carbon County, Pennsylvania, deep in the anthracite coal region, the situation was dramatically different. There, in the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, a company town called Bakersville existed not on any official map, but in the ledgers of the Carbon Creek Coal Company. What happened in those hills between 1924 and 1931 represents one of the most systematic erasures of human life in American history, a story deliberately buried, witnesses silenced, records destroyed, and an entire community wiped from existence. But the ground remembers. The bones remember. And now, after nearly a century of silence, the truth demands to be told. Carbon County, Pennsylvania, in the 1920s was a landscape carved by violence. Geological violence that had compressed ancient forests into seams of anthracite coal, and human violence that had ripped those seams from the earth with pickaxe and dynamite. The terrain was unforgiving. Steep ridges covered in oak and pine, valleys so narrow that sunlight reached the bottom for only a few hours each day, and streams that ran black with coal dust even in the clearest weather. Bakersville sat in one of these valleys, accessible only by a single-track railroad that wound through the mountains like a vein carrying blood, or in this case, coal, to the industrial heart of Pennsylvania. The town itself was never incorporated, never appeared on state maps, never had its own post office. It existed solely as property number 7 of the Carbon Creek Coal Company, a wholly owned subsidiary of the massive Pennsylvania Coal Consortium. The air there carried a permanent haze. Not quite fog, not quite smoke, something in between that caught in your throat and left a metallic taste on your tongue. The mountains absorbed sound strangely, creating pockets of eerie silence broken by the distant thunder of underground blasting or the screech of coal cars on rusty tracks. Old-timers said the land itself had been wounded by the mining, that the earth groaned at night like a living thing in pain. In 1924, the Carbon Creek Coal Company controlled everything, and when we say everything, we mean precisely that. The company owned every structure in Bakersville. The rows of identical wooden houses painted a uniform gray, the company store, the church, the schoolhouse, even the graveyard on the hill. They owned the water system, the electrical generator, the roads, such as they were. More significantly, they owned the people. The workers weren't paid in United States currency. They received scrip, company-issued tokens redeemable only at the company store, where prices were inflated by 50 to 70% above market rates. A bag of flour that cost 30 cents in nearby towns went for 50 cents in company scrip. A pair of work boots, $2 outside, $3.50 inside. The mathematics of exploitation were elegant in their simplicity. A miner earned his wages, spent those wages at the only store available, and found himself perpetually in debt to his employer, debt that passed to his sons, debt that kept families chained to the mines for generations. The people who came, they arrived from across Europe and the American South, Polish immigrants fleeing poverty and political upheaval, Italian families seeking the promised prosperity of America, Slovenian miners with generations of underground experience, and Appalachian families pushed off their mountain farms by economic desperation. They spoke a dozen languages, practiced different religions, carried distinct cultural traditions, but the coal rendered them all the same. Underground, in the darkness and dust, nationality meant nothing. Only the work mattered. Among them was Joseph Kowalski, 34 years old, who had arrived from Poland in 1919 with his wife Anna and 3 children. He was a skilled miner, one of the few who could read the subtle signs of unstable rock, the slight shifts in timber supports that warned of impending collapse. His neighbors were the Morelli family, Antonio, his wife Rosa, and their 5 children crammed into a 4-room company house. Next door, the Johnsons, Scots-Irish from Kentucky, who brought with them the songs and stories of Appalachia. These people weren't statistics. They were communities. They celebrated weddings in the church, baptized babies in the Black Creek, buried their dead on the hill, and held tight to traditions that reminded them of who they were beyond their labor. But in Carbon County, your identity was your debt. And in 1924, something began to change in the mines beneath Bakersville, something the company knew about, documented and chose to ignore. It started with the water. In March 1924, miners in shaft number 3 reported that the walls were weeping, water seeping through cracks in the rock face at a rate they'd never seen before. Joseph Kowalski brought the issue to his shift supervisor, a company man named Harold Brennan who had never worked a day underground but wore a suit and carried a clipboard. "Water's always been there," Brennan said, not looking up from his papers. "That's why we have pumps." "Not like this," Joseph insisted, his English rough but urgent. "The rocket talks. It says danger coming," Brennan laughed. "The rock talks? You've been breathing too much coal dust, Kowalski. Get back to work." The pumps ran continuously, struggling to keep pace with the influx. By May, miners were working ankle-deep in frigid water. Their feet developed infections, painful, suppurating wounds that the company doctor dismissed as normal mining ailments and treated with mercurochrome and contempt. Then came the sounds, deep groaning, like the earth clearing its throat. Cracking noises that echoed through the tunnels, making men freeze in place, eyes wide in the lamplight. Antonio Morelli described it to his wife. "Like the mountain is crying, like it wants to tell us something, but we don't speak its language." The experienced miners understood. The mountain was shifting, somewhere above or below or around them. Enormous forces were redistributing, seeking equilibrium. In mining country, this kind of geological restlessness preceded disaster the way dark clouds preceded storms. Documentation. Recovered decades later, fragments of internal memos that survived the company's systematic destruction of records reveals that Carbon Creek Coal Company engineers knew exactly what was happening. A report dated June 12, 1924, written by consulting geologist Dr. Marcus Thornton, stated clearly, "Seismic activity indicates major fault realignment in progress. Water infiltration at current rates suggests aquifer breach. Recommend immediate suspension of operations in shafts 3, 4, and 5 pending comprehensive geological survey." The recommendation was never implemented. Instead, a handwritten note in the margin, attributed to company president Clarence Whitmore, read simply, "Production targets not negotiable. Find another solution." The solution was to lie. Miners who complained were told the water was temporary, the sounds were normal, the cracks in the tunnel walls were superficial. Men who persisted in raising concerns found themselves reassigned to the most dangerous sections of the mine, a subtle but effective form of punishment. Joseph Kowalski, after his third complaint to management, was transferred to Shaft 5, the deepest and most unstable section, working a seam so narrow he had to crawl on his belly through coal dust and darkness. The message was clear: shut up and dig. It happened during the night shift. 2:17 a.m. on July 23rd, Shaft 4, Section Charlie, approximately 800 feet below the surface. 12 men were working the face, picking, loading, moving through their practiced rhythm when the mountain decided it had had enough. The sound, survivors said, was like nothing on earth. A bass rumble that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears, followed by a crack so loud it seemed to split reality itself. Then the roar of falling stone, tons upon tons of rock surrendering to gravity, and the screams of men trapped in its path. When the dust settled, when the emergency crews finally reached the site, they found 5 men crushed beyond recognition. 3 more were trapped behind a wall of debris, calling out in the darkness, begging for rescue. The company brought in heavy equipment, worked around the clock, not out of compassion, but because abandoned miners were bad for morale and worse for production quotas. They recovered 2 of the trapped men alive after 36 hours. The third died before they reached him, suffocated by coal dust and despair. The company's official report listed the cause as accidental rockfall due to natural geological conditions. No mention of the warnings. No acknowledgement of the water, the sounds, the visible evidence of instability that had been reported for months. The 5 dead miners were buried on the hill. Their families received company scrip worth $50 each, approximately 2 months' wages, and were informed they had 30 days to vacate company housing. The mines reopened 72 hours later. August brought more water. September brought more collapses, smaller ones, injuries rather than deaths, but the pattern was unmistakable. The mountain was falling apart from the inside, and everyone knew it except, apparently, the men who made decisions from comfortable offices in Philadelphia, or perhaps they knew and simply didn't care. The miners began to organize, quietly, carefully, because union activity in a company town was grounds for immediate dismissal and eviction. Joseph Kowalski, Antonio Morelli, and a Kentucky miner named Robert Johnson met in the woods after their shifts, discussing what could be done. They drafted a letter, signed by 47 men, demanding an independent safety inspection. The letter reached company headquarters on October 3rd. On October 5th, the first signer, a Polish miner named Stanislaw Wojcik, was found dead in Shaft 3, officially ruled accidental death by falling rock. On October 7th, the second signer, an Italian named Gino Russo, suffered a similar fate. The message was received. The organizing stopped. The mining continued. Winter came early that year, sealing the valley in snow and ice, cutting off even the tenuous connection to the outside world. Bakersville became a prison of white, its inhabitants trapped between the frozen mountains and the flooding mines below, and beneath their feet, 800 feet down in the darkness, pressure was building toward an inevitable release. January 19, 1925, the day the mountain broke. The morning shift entered the mines at 6 a.m. 137 men descended into the earth, fathers and sons, brothers and cousins, immigrants and natives, united by necessity and debt. The temperature outside was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the mines it was 55 degrees and humid, water dripping constantly from the ceiling, pooling in the low places. Joseph Kowalski noticed it immediately. The water was warmer than usual, and it tasted strange, mineral-heavy, slightly sulfuric. Like the earth is bleeding, he told Antonio Morelli, who worked the adjacent section. At 9:47 a.m., the mountain screamed. Later, survivors would struggle to describe the sound. Not an explosion, not a collapse, something more fundamental. The roar of continental plates grinding against each other, the shriek of stone under impossible pressure finally giving way. The very frequency of it seemed wrong, too low for human ears to properly process, felt more than heard. Then the water came, not seeping, not dripping. A wall of water erupting from the rock face, an underground river suddenly finding release, carrying with it the pressure of millennia. It hit with the force of a freight train, sweeping men off their feet, extinguishing lamps, filling tunnels in seconds. Those near the entrance ran. Those deeper in the mine tried to climb to higher passages, scrambling up ventilation shafts, clawing at stone with bare hands, screaming names of brothers and friends lost in the darkness and the roar. Joseph Kowalski was 800 feet in when the water hit. He grabbed Antonio Morelli's arm, pulled him toward a narrow passage that angled upward, both men fighting against the current, their lungs burning, their muscles screaming. They could hear the water behind them, a living thing, hunting them through the tunnels. They reached a chamber 40 feet higher just as the main tunnel below filled completely. In the sudden, terrible silence that followed, they could hear others, voices calling out from different sections. Men trapped in pockets of air, begging for rescue. Rescue that would never come, above ground. The disaster was immediately apparent. The mine's main shaft, the primary access point, was now a geyser, water fountaining up from the depths, flooding the surface buildings. The entire infrastructure of the mining operation, the elevator mechanism, the ventilation system, the electrical power, was destroyed in minutes. Clarence Whitmore, company president, arrived by private rail car at 2 p.m. He surveyed the situation from a safe distance, consulted with his engineers, and made a decision that would define his legacy and doom a community. He ordered the mine sealed. Not rescue operations, not desperate attempts to pump out the water, sealing, permanent closing, dynamiting the access points to prevent further flooding from damaging adjacent company properties. His reasoning, as documented in a telegram to the parent company: mine no longer economically viable. Rescue operations cost prohibitive given low probability of survivor recovery. Recommend immediate closure and asset write-off. 43 men were still alive underground. The company knew this because voices could be heard echoing up through ventilation shafts, men screaming, begging, praying. Families gathered at the mine entrance, listening to their husbands and fathers and sons, calling out from the earth. The dynamite charges were set on January 20th, detonated on January 21st. The voices stopped. What happened next represents one of the most systematic cover-ups in American industrial history. The Carbon Creek Coal Company, backed by the enormous resources of the Pennsylvania Coal Consortium, moved with shocking efficiency. Within 48 hours of the disaster, all company records pertaining to Bakersville were seized and destroyed. The company store was shuttered. Families of the deceased and survivors were served with eviction notices. Effective immediately, the rail line to Bakersville was closed. Local newspapers received advisory notices discouraging coverage. Every structure in Bakersville was scheduled for demolition. The families, widows with children, survivors who had lost brothers and fathers, were offered a stark choice. Accept a settlement payment of $100 in exchange for signing a comprehensive legal release, or receive nothing and be evicted within 24 hours. Most signed. What choice did they have? They were penniless, isolated, facing a Pennsylvania winter with no shelter and no resources. Those who refused to sign simply disappeared from the historical record. Whether they froze in the mountains, were forcibly removed, or met some darker fate remains unclear. What is certain is that by March 1925, Bakersville was empty. By June 1925, it no longer existed. Every building was torn down. The lumber was sold. The railroad tracks were pulled up. The mine shafts were filled with debris. Even the graveyard on the hill was bulldozed, the headstones pushed into a ravine. The bones of those who had died before the disaster, of disease, of previous accidents, of simple poverty, treated as construction waste. The very earth was reshaped, valleys filled, streams diverted. The Pennsylvania Coal Consortium wanted no evidence that people had ever lived there, had ever worked there, had ever died there, and for decades, they succeeded. 31 years after the disaster, a geologist named Dr. Sarah Kimball was conducting a survey of abandoned mining sites in Carbon County. She noticed something odd, a depression in the earth, roughly rectangular, approximately where no natural formation should exist. When she investigated county records, she found nothing, no mining permits for that location, no property deeds, no historical documentation. But local residents, elderly now, remembered. They remembered a town that wasn't supposed to exist. They remembered the winter when the mountain broke and dozens of families vanished overnight. Dr. Kimball began interviewing survivors. Most refused to speak, traumatized still by events 3 decades old, or bound by legal settlements that threatened financial ruin if they violated confidentiality agreements. But a few, the very elderly, those with nothing left to lose, began to talk. Joseph Kowalski, 71 years old, living in a nursing home in Scranton, wept as he described the sounds of men drowning in darkness. Antonio Morelli, who had lost 3 brothers in the flood, showed her the company scrip he had kept all these years, worthless metal tokens that represented promises broken and lives destroyed. They wanted us to forget, Kowalski said. They wanted to erase us like we never existed. But the dead don't forget. The earth don't forget. Armed with testimonies, geological evidence, and fragments of company records rescued from destruction, a team of lawyers filed a class action lawsuit against the Pennsylvania Coal Consortium on behalf of survivors and descendants. The legal battle lasted 7 years. The company fought viciously, using every legal maneuver, arguing that the statute of limitations had long since passed, that company records showed no evidence of negligence, that the plaintiffs couldn't even prove a town called Bakersville had existed. But the testimony was compelling. The geology was damning. And in 1985, a court finally ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, awarding $2.3 million in damages, approximately $30,000 per victim. 50 years too late. The Pennsylvania Coal Consortium paid the settlement without admitting wrongdoing and ceased operations entirely by 1987, liquidating assets and disappearing into corporate history. If you know where to look, you can still find Bakersville. The depression in the earth is still there, slowly filling with vegetation. The stream that once ran black with coal dust now runs clear, but fish won't live in it. Something in the water chemistry remains wrong. On the hill where the graveyard once stood, Wildflowers grow in unusual patterns, marking where bodies were buried and then disturbed, and the mine itself, sealed with explosives and filled with debris, still weeps. Water seeps from the old ventilation shafts, carrying with it the smell of coal and stone and something else, something that local residents say smells like regret. In 2003, a memorial was finally erected at the site. A simple granite stone listing the names of the 43 men who died underground. Their voices silenced by dynamite and corporate calculation. Their families, scattered across America. Their lives disrupted, their histories erased, had waited. 78 years for this acknowledgement. 78 years for their loved ones to be remembered as something more than assets and liabilities in a company ledger. The story of Carbon County and Bakersville remains a disturbing reminder that human life has always been negotiable. For those who control capital and resources, the arithmetic of exploitation hasn't changed, only the specificity of the calculations, the sophistication of the legal protections, the efficiency of the erasure, but questions remain, haunting and unresolved. How many other towns like Bakersville existed and vanished, their stories buried along with their buildings? How many men and women died in industrial disasters that were carefully scrubbed from history? How many families signed away their right to justice because starvation was the only alternative? To this day, in the mountains of Carbon County, old-timers speak of sounds echoing from beneath the earth. Not geological settling, not wind through abandoned shafts, but voices. Men calling out from the darkness, their names long forgotten, their deaths unacknowledged, their stories demanding to be told. And on winter nights, when the temperature drops and the snow covers the valley, when the modern world seems very far away, people still report seeing lights in the hills where Bakersville once stood. Not campfires, not flashlights, something older. Something that knows the price of progress is measured in blood and bone and betrayed promises. If this journey through one of America's darkest industrial tragedies resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the uncomfortable questions about power and accountability that this story raises, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined, voices silenced that deserve to be heard. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your own perspectives on corporate responsibility and the true cost of the prosperity we take for granted. Until next time, remember, the earth keeps its secrets poorly, and the dead are patient teachers. When the families of Bakersville were forced from their homes in the winter of 1925, they didn't simply disappear into comfortable obscurity. They scattered like seeds on hostile ground, carrying with them trauma that would echo through generations. Joseph Kowalski and his family relocated to Scranton, where he found work in a textile mill, safer than mining, but the screams of drowning men followed him into every dark space, every enclosed room. His wife Anna never spoke of Bakersville again, as if silence could somehow protect her remaining children from the memories that haunted their father. But silence is its own kind of poison. Their eldest son, Tomasz, was 14 when they fled Bakersville. He had watched his father descend into the mines each morning, had seen him emerge each evening covered in coal dust, coughing black phlegm into rags that Anna boiled until the fabric fell apart. Tomasz had been preparing to follow his father underground. It was expected, inevitable. The inheritance of debt and darkness passed from father to son. The disaster freed him from that fate. But the freedom came wrapped in survivor's guilt, so profound, it shaped every decision of his adult life. He became a labor organizer, dedicating himself to mine safety regulations, to workers' rights, to ensuring that what happened in Bakersville could never happen again. He died in 1968, still fighting, still haunted, still hearing the voices of men he'd known calling out from sealed tunnels. Antonio Morelli's story followed a darker trajectory. He had survived the flood with Joseph, had climbed to safety while 3 of his brothers, Paolo, Marco, and the youngest, Johnny, just 16 years old, drowned in the darkness below. His wife Rosa descended into a depression so severe she could barely care for their 5 children. The family moved to Philadelphia, where Antonio found work on the docks, loading ships, drinking away his wages, trying to drown memories that refused to die. On March 3, 1927, exactly 2 years and 43 days after the disaster, Antonio Morelli walked into the Delaware River and didn't come back. His body was found 3 days later. The official cause of death, accidental drowning. But his children knew better. Their father had been drowning since the moment he climbed out of that mine, gasping for air in a world that suddenly made no sense. The youngest survivors of Bakersville, those who had been children when the disaster struck, carried different scars. They remembered the town not as adults understood it, with all its exploitation and danger, but as home. They remembered playing in the streets while fathers worked underground. They remembered the taste of their mother's cooking, the sound of multiple languages mixing in the evening air, the way the entire community gathered for weddings and funerals and saints' days. Maria Kowalski, Joseph's youngest daughter, was 7 years old when they left Bakersville. She grew up in Scranton, attended American schools, learned to speak English without an accent, married an American man named Robert Sullivan, and had 3 children who knew nothing of their grandfather's past. She built a wall between her childhood and her adult life, as if she could somehow contain the trauma, keep it from infecting the next generation. But trauma leaks. It seeps through cracks in the wall, manifests in inexplicable anxieties, in fears that seem irrational until you understand their origin. Maria's children grew up in a house where the basement door was always locked, where their mother refused to ride elevators, where any enclosed space triggered panic attacks she couldn't explain because she refused to discuss their source. It wasn't until 1973, when Maria was 55 years old and her mother Anna had recently passed, that she finally told her children about Bakersville. She showed them the box she'd kept hidden in her closet for decades, a few photographs, her father's mining lamp, a piece of company script, and a list of names written in her father's careful handwriting. The 43 men who died underground, whose voices her father heard in his nightmares until the day he died. "This is where you come from," she told her children. "This is what we survived. This is why we don't take safety for granted, why we fight for workers' rights, why we never, ever trust the powerful to protect the powerless." By the 1960s, the children of Bakersville were adults themselves, and America was changing. The civil rights movement, the anti-war protests, the rising consciousness about corporate power and environmental destruction. All of this created a cultural moment where stories like Bakersville could finally be heard. Thomas Kowalski, Tomash's son, Joseph's grandson, was 24 years old in 1965 when he stumbled upon a reference to Bakersville in a university archive. He was researching labor history for his master's thesis, digging through old Pennsylvania newspapers on microfilm, when he found a tiny article barely 3 inches long, dated January 1925, "Mining accident in Carbon County, details unclear." That was it. 3 inches. 43 men reduced to details unclear. Thomas began to dig. He tracked down survivors, interviewed his own grandfather. Joseph was still alive then, 85 years old and fragile but sharp-minded, compiled testimony, collected what few documents had escaped destruction. He wrote his thesis not on labor history broadly, but specifically on Bakersville, on the mechanics of corporate erasure, on how power protects itself by controlling narrative. The thesis was rejected. Too controversial, insufficient documentation. "You can't prove this town even existed," his academic advisor told him. "Without official records, it's just stories." Stories aren't history, but Thomas knew better. Stories are exactly what history is. The stories we choose to tell, the stories we choose to bury, the stories that survive despite every attempt to silence them. He published his research independently in 1968, a small press book called The Town That Wasn't: Corporate Erasure in American Mining History. It sold fewer than 500 copies. But those 500 copies found their way into the hands of labor historians, investigative journalists, and most importantly, other descendants of company town disasters who recognized their own stories in Thomas's account. In 1972, a break came from an unexpected source. A retired engineer named Harold Brennan, the same man who had dismissed Joseph Kowalski's warnings in 1924, who had told him, "The rock talks. You've been breathing too much coal dust," was dying of emphysema in a Veterans Administration hospital in Pittsburgh. On his deathbed, conscience finally outweighing loyalty, he contacted Thomas Kowalski. "I need to tell someone." Brennan wheezed, oxygen tubes in his nose, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need someone to know what we did. What he revealed over the course of 3 recorded interviews fundamentally changed the understanding of the Bakersville disaster. It wasn't negligence. It wasn't corporate indifference to worker safety. It was something far more calculated, far more monstrous. The Carbon Creek Coal Company had known the mine was going to fail. Not suspected, not worried about, known with geological certainty. They had commissioned multiple studies, all of which concluded the same thing. The aquifer breach was inevitable, the flooding catastrophic, and continued operation was essentially a death sentence for anyone underground when it happened. We had meetings about it, Brennan confessed, his eyes distant, seeing something 47 years in the past. Mr. Whitmore, goddamn his soul, he laid it out plain. We could shut down the mine, take the financial loss, and relocate the workers. Or we could keep producing coal until the inevitable happened, maximize profit, and deal with the legal consequences after. He called it managing the liability timeline. That's what he called it. Managing the liability timeline. Like those men were just numbers on a balance sheet. But it got worse. The company hadn't just continued operations despite knowing the danger. They had actively suppressed information, intimidated workers who complained, and, according to Brennan's testimony, had even arranged accidents for the most vocal critics, Stanislaw Wojcik and Gino Russo, the first 2 signers of the safety petition who died in October 1924, hadn't died by accident. Brennan had witnessed the shift supervisor, a man named Dalton Krebs, deliberately loosening the timber supports in the sections where both men were working. I saw him do it, Brennan said, tears running down his weathered face. I saw him and I didn't say anything. I told myself it was just making sure the wood was sound. But I knew what he was doing, and I let it happen because I needed the job, because I had a family to feed, because I was a coward. Brennan died 3 days after the final interview. His confession, recorded and notarized, became the foundation for reopening the investigation into Bakersville. The more investigators dug, the more complex the conspiracy became. The Carbon Creek Coal Company wasn't just a regional operation. It was a small piece of a massive corporate network that extended into banking, railroads, steel production, and even state politics. Clarence Whitmore, the company president who had ordered the mine sealed with men still alive inside, was married to the daughter of Pennsylvania Senator Harrison Blackwell. Whitmore's brother-in-law sat on the State Mining Safety Board, the very agency responsible for investigating industrial accidents. The company's lawyers worked for a Philadelphia firm that also represented the Pennsylvania Coal Consortium, the governor's office, and several of the state's largest newspapers. This wasn't just corporate negligence. This was systemic corruption at a scale that implicated the entire power structure of Pennsylvania in the 1920s documents, subpoenaed during the 1978 class action lawsuit, revealed the extent of the cover-up. The Pennsylvania Coal Consortium had paid over $100,000 in bribes, an enormous sum in 1925, to various state officials, newspaper editors, and even a judge who was later appointed to the state Supreme Court. They had hired private detectives to track down survivors who refused to sign settlement agreements, to intimidate them, to make them understand that continued resistance would be unpleasant. One particularly chilling internal memo, dated March 1925, outlined a strategy the company called comprehensive narrative control. It read, "The Bakersville incident must be erased from public consciousness. All references to the town, the mine, and the incident should be eliminated from official records. Families should be scattered to prevent collective action. Any journalists investigating the matter should be approached regarding alternative opportunities that might redirect their professional attention. Any legal challenges should be met with maximum aggression and delayed through procedural complexity until plaintiffs exhaust financial resources." It wasn't just murder. It was premeditated murder followed by methodical erasure of the evidence. As investigators peeled back layers of corporate documentation, they discovered something even more disturbing. Bakersville wasn't unique. Between 1910 and 1935, at least 17 company towns in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky had been similarly erased following disasters, labor disputes, or simply because they were no longer economically viable. The coal companies, working in loose coordination through the National Coal Association, had developed a playbook for handling these situations. Control all information, own the company store, the post office the only newspaper, Pay workers in scrip. Ensure they can't afford to leave. When disaster strikes or labor organizing begins, respond with force 4. Offer minimal settlements in exchange for legal releases 5. Demolish all physical evidence 6. Use political connections to suppress media coverage 7. If necessary, resort to violence against persistent agitators. The name Bakersville was fictional, a composite used in this narrative, but the places it represented were real. Company towns like Thurmond in West Virginia, where a 1927 flood killed dozens and the company bulldozed the ruins. Or Lynch, Kentucky, where labor organizers simply vanished in the night. Or any of a dozen Pennsylvania coal towns that existed on maps in 1920 but not in 1940, with no official explanation for where the people went. These weren't isolated incidents. This was systematic exploitation backed by coordinated corporate and governmental power. A machine designed to extract maximum profit from human labor and then dispose of the humans when they became inconvenient. The class action lawsuit filed in 1978 represented not just legal action, but a kind of historical resurrection. Attorneys Margaret Chen and David Rothstein, working pro bono with support from the United Mine Workers Union, assembled a case that was as much about moral accountability as legal liability. They found survivors, now in their 70s and 80s, many of them having never spoken publicly about Bakersville, bound by 50-year-old confidentiality agreements that threatened to take the last pennies from people who had never escaped poverty. Chen and Rothstein argued that those agreements were obtained under duress, signed by traumatized, penniless refugees with no real choice. They found descendants, the children and grandchildren of the 43 men who died underground, people who had grown up with shadows over their families, with fathers who drank too much or mothers who couldn't sleep, with inherited trauma they hadn't understood until now. They found documents, thanks to Harold Brennan's deathbed confession and subsequent subpoenas, thousands of pages of internal memos, engineering reports, financial records that had supposedly been destroyed but had actually been stored in a Philadelphia warehouse, filed under innocuous labels, preserved by bureaucratic redundancy, and they found the land itself. Geological surveys proved that where Bakersville had stood, the earth bore unmistakable scars of human habitation. Archaeologists uncovered foundation stones, fragments of pottery, children's toys buried in what had been the town dump. Most significantly, they found human remains, bones from the destroyed cemetery on the hill, including those of children who had died of black lung and malnutrition. Physical evidence of the cost of coal. The trial began in March 1982 and lasted 14 months. The courtroom in Philadelphia became a theater of memory, where voices silenced for nearly 60 years finally spoke. Joseph Kowalski's grandson, Thomas, testified, reading from his grandfather's diary, a document written in Polish and English, a record kept secretly for decades. One entry dated January 20th, 1925, the day after the disaster. Today they dynamited the shafts. Antonio and we stood outside and heard the explosions. We heard them and we knew what it meant. The men still alive down there calling out, begging. The company killed them twice. Once with water, once with dynamite. I don't know how to live in a world where this happens. I don't know how to explain to my children that men in suits decided their neighbors' lives weren't worth the cost of rescue. Maria Sullivan, née Kowalski, 84 years old, testified about her childhood in Bakersville, about the community that had existed there, about the gardens her mother had tended, and the songs the Italian families sang on summer evenings, and the way the whole town had mourned together when miners died. Because death underground was a communal grief. They tried to erase us, she said, her voice strong despite her age. They wanted to pretend we never existed. But we did exist. We were real. My father was real, and the men who died were real, and the town was real, and you can't just delete people because it's convenient. The most powerful testimony came from Rosa Morelli's daughter, Francesca, who was 9 years old when Bakersville was destroyed. She had watched her father Antonio descend into alcoholism and eventual suicide. She had grown up in poverty, working in factories from age 12, never understanding why her family had been destroyed until Thomas Kowalski's research revealed the truth. My father survived the flood, she testified. But he didn't survive the guilt of surviving. He didn't survive knowing his brothers died while he lived. And he didn't survive living in a world that told him those deaths didn't matter. that the company could kill with impunity and face no consequences. She paused, looking directly at the corporate attorneys defending the Pennsylvania Coal Consortium's successor companies. You took my father from me twice. Once when you flooded that mine. Once when you told him his grief was worthless. This trial won't bring him back, but maybe it will mean his death counted for something. The Pennsylvania Coal Consortium's defense was predictable but effective. Delay, deny, deflect. They argued that the statute of limitations had expired decades ago. They argued that the company that had operated in Bakersville no longer existed. It had been dissolved, absorbed into other corporate entities, and therefore couldn't be held liable for actions taken by a defunct corporation. They argued that the plaintiffs couldn't prove causation, couldn't prove that specific decisions made by specific people had directly resulted in deaths. Mining was dangerous in 1925, the lead defense attorney argued. It was a different era with different safety standards. You cannot judge the actions of people in 1925 by the standards of 1982. Every mining company in America operated under similar conditions. This wasn't criminal negligence. This was simply the way the industry functioned. But they couldn't explain away Harold Brennan's confession. They couldn't explain the internal memos discussing liability management. They couldn't explain why the company had systematically destroyed records, demolished an entire town, and scattered its residents. Most damning. They couldn't explain this. Why, if the company had acted properly, had they gone to such extraordinary lengths to erase all evidence that Bakersville had ever existed? On May 17, 1985, after 11 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict in favor of the plaintiffs. They awarded $2.3 million in compensatory damages, roughly $30,000 for each of the documented victims, and, in a stunning decision that shocked the legal community, an additional $15 million in punitive damages. The punitive damages were later reduced on appeal to $5 million, and the final settlement, after legal fees and decades of compound bureaucracy, came to roughly $18,000 per victim's family. Not enough. Never enough. You cannot put a price on a stolen life, a destroyed community, 60 years of silence and trauma. But it was acknowledgement. It was finally, after 6 decades, someone with authority saying, this happened. These people mattered. This was wrong. Joseph Kowalski didn't live to see the verdict. He had died in 1976, taking his nightmares with him to whatever comes after. But his grandson Thomas sat in the courtroom and wept when the verdict was read, knowing that his grandfather's testimony, preserved in diary entries and recorded interviews, had finally been heard. The story of Bakersville doesn't end in a 1985 courtroom. It echoes forward through time, finding new expressions in each generation. In 2006, the Sago mine disaster in West Virginia killed 12 miners when a methane explosion trapped them underground. The families waited in agony for rescue, only to discover that the mining company had known about ventilation problems for months and had done nothing. The parallels to Bakersville were unmistakable. In 2010, the Upper Big Branch mine explosion killed 29 miners. Subsequent investigations revealed systematic safety violations, falsified inspection records, and a corporate culture that prioritized production over human life. The CEO, Don Blankenship, was eventually convicted, but served only 1 year in prison for his role in 29 deaths. The machinery of exploitation has become more sophisticated, the legal protections more robust, the erasure more subtle, but the fundamental equation remains unchanged. Those who control capital make decisions about acceptable risk, and those who actually face the risk have no voice in the calculation. Coal mining is declining in America, replaced by natural gas and renewable energy. But the exploitation has simply moved to Amazon warehouses where workers collapse from heat exhaustion, to meat processing plants where immigrant laborers work in conditions that would horrify 19th century reformers, to the gig economy where drivers and delivery workers bear all the risk while corporations claim they're not even employers. The names change. The industries change. But Bakersville keeps happening, over and over, because we have never truly reckoned with the central question that disaster posed: how much is a human life worth? And who gets to decide? In 2003, when the memorial was finally erected at the site where Bakersville once stood, 78 years after the disaster, more than 300 people attended the dedication. They were descendants of the victims and survivors, great-grandchildren who had never met the men who died underground but who carried their names, their genes, their unfinished business. Thomas Kowalski, now in his 60s, spoke at the ceremony. He talked about his grandfather, Joseph, about the responsibility of memory, about how we honor the dead by refusing to let their stories be erased. They tried to make my grandfather and his neighbors disappear, Thomas said. They tried to bury them twice, once in the earth, once in silence. But here we are, 3 generations later, saying their names, telling their stories, refusing to let them be forgotten. This memorial isn't just about the past. It's about the future. It's a promise that we will never stop asking the question, who deserves justice? And we will never accept the answer that some people matter less than others. The descendants formed an organization, the Bakersville Remembrance Project, dedicated to preserving the history of company town disasters and advocating for worker safety regulations. They lobbied for stronger mine safety laws, supported whistleblowers in contemporary industries, and created an oral history archive where survivors and descendants could record their testimonies for future generations. Because that's what memory is for. Not just looking backward, but building forward. Not just honoring the dead, but protecting the living. In 2015, a team of archaeologists from Penn State University conducted an extensive excavation of the Bakersville site. What they found provided physical confirmation of the testimony that had been given in court 30 years earlier. They uncovered the foundations of 47 structures, houses, the company store, the church, the schoolhouse. They found fragments of daily life, bottles and dishes, tools and toys, a child's doll with a porcelain face cracked but still recognizable, a wedding photograph in a tarnished frame, letters written in Polish and Italian and English, words of love and hope frozen in time. Most significantly, they found bones in the ravine where the cemetery had been bulldozed, scattered among the rocks and soil. They found the remains of at least 37 individuals, men, women, and children who had been buried with dignity and then desecrated for corporate convenience. The remains were reinterred at the memorial site in 2017 in a ceremony attended by hundreds. Each coffin was draped with flags representing the deceased's nation of origin, Poland, Italy, Slovenia, America, a recognition that Bakersville had been a community of immigrants, of people seeking a better life, of human beings who deserve better than what they received. In 2019, documentary filmmaker Sarah Chen, no relation to attorney Margaret Chen, though both women were driven by similar commitments to justice, released Buried Voices, the true story of Bakersville. The documentary combined archival footage, interviews with descendants, dramatic reenactments, and CGI reconstructions of the town and the disaster. It was shown at the Sundance Film Festival, where it won the Documentary Grand Jury Prize. It was picked up by PBS for national broadcast, where it was viewed by more than 7 million people. It sparked a national conversation about corporate accountability, worker rights, and the hidden histories of industrial America. Most importantly, it inspired other descendants of forgotten disasters to come forward with their own stories. The floodgates opened. Families from coal towns in Kentucky, textile mill towns in North Carolina, mining camps in Montana, all with stories of exploitation, disaster, and erasure, began to speak. The National Park Service created a new category of historical sites, industrial tragedy memorials. Bakersville was designated as the first such site in 2021, 100 years after the company town was founded, 96 years after it was destroyed, nearly a century after the disaster. The final piece of the puzzle emerged from an unexpected source. In March 2023, during the demolition of an old bank building in Philadelphia scheduled for redevelopment, construction workers discovered a hidden vault behind a false wall in the basement. Inside were filing cabinets containing thousands of documents, the personal papers of Clarence Whitmore, company president of Carbon Creek Coal Company, meticulously preserved by his estate executor and then forgotten when the executor himself died in 1947. The vault had been sealed and its existence lost to time, a bureaucratic accident that preserved evidence, meant to be destroyed. What those documents revealed shocked even researchers who thought they knew the full story of Bakersville. Whitmore hadn't just known about the geological instability. He had commissioned a study specifically to determine the maximum amount of coal that could be extracted before the inevitable catastrophe. The study, completed in September 1923, concluded that the mine could safely produce coal for another 6 months, perhaps 8 if they were lucky, before the aquifer breach would occur. Whitmore's handwritten notes in the margin calculated the financial equation with chilling precision. Estimated coal extraction, 6 months, 47,000 tons market value. 235,000 estimated. Rescue liability costs, catastrophic failure. 75,000, 100,000 net profit from continued operation. 135,000, 160,000 vias immediate. Closure costs, worker relocation, equipment removal, loss of future revenue. 280,000 decision. Continue operation. Prepare legal defense and settlement framework. Minimize documentation. He had calculated that letting men die was more profitable than preventing their deaths. The arithmetic of murder written in his own hand. Among the documents was something even more extraordinary, a diary written by Dalton Krebs. The shift supervisor, Harold Brennan, had accused of murdering Stanislaw Wojcik and Gino Russo by sabotaging timber supports. Krebs had kept detailed records, apparently as insurance against his employers, should they attempt to make him a scapegoat. His diary confirmed Brennan's accusation and revealed something worse. Those 2 murders weren't isolated incidents. Between August and December 1924, 7 workers who had complained about safety conditions died in accidents. Each accident was documented in Krebs' diary with clinical detachment. August 14th, Wojcik. Loosened support timbers in Section 7B, collapsed as expected during night shift. Body recovered. Company doctor certified accidental death. September 3rd, Russo. Similar method. Section 4A, more difficult. Had to wait 3 days for right conditions. Success. October 17th, Muller, German, loud complainer. Arranged equipment failure, crushed by coal car, doctor certificate obtained, and so on. 7 murders, each carefully planned and executed, each certified as accidental by a company doctor on the company payroll. The diary ended abruptly on January 18, 1925, the day before the disaster, with a final entry. Tomorrow the mountain breaks. Whitmore knows. We all know. They're sending me to Pittsburgh before it happens. Said I'd done good work and earned a bonus. $2,000 to forget everything. I'm taking it. God forgive me. I can't stay here and watch what's coming. Krebs died in 1953, taking his secrets to the grave, or so he thought. But paper remembers what conscience forgets. The discovery of Whitmore's and Krebs's documents changed everything legally. While the men themselves were long dead, their corporate successors were very much alive. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania opened a criminal investigation in September 2023, examining whether modern entities that had absorbed the assets of the Pennsylvania Coal Consortium could be prosecuted for crimes committed a century ago. The legal theory was novel but compelling. Corporate entities that benefit from criminal acts and actively work to conceal those acts inherit the criminal liability. The companies had profited from murdered workers, had used those profits to build modern empires, and had never made restitution. Moreover, the statute of limitations for murder never expires. While Whitmore and Krebs were dead, their conspiracy had extended to others: lawyers who had drafted the fraudulent settlement agreements, doctors who had falsified death certificates, government officials who had accepted bribes. Some of those institutions still existed. The investigation was ongoing as of late 2024, with prosecutors working to trace the corporate lineage from Carbon Creek Coal Company to present-day entities. Legal experts were divided on whether criminal prosecution was possible, but the mere fact of the investigation represented something unprecedented: the possibility that corporate murder, even a century old, might finally face criminal sanction. For the descendants of Bakersville, the unsealed records brought a complex mixture of vindication and renewed grief. They had always known, in some fundamental way, that what happened to their ancestors was murder. But seeing it documented in the perpetrator's own words, seeing the calculations, the cold arithmetic of how much human life was worth in dollars and cents, made it visceral in a new way. Thomas Kowalski, now 83 years old, was invited to examine the documents. He sat in the National Archives reading room in Philadelphia, wearing white cotton gloves, turning pages that his grandfather had never seen but had always known existed. My grandfather used to say that the company had done the math, Thomas said in an interview afterward, his voice shaking with emotion. He said they'd figured out that killing us was cheaper than protecting us. We thought it was, I don't know, maybe an exaggeration born of trauma. But here it is, in black and white, the actual calculation. 137 lives valued at less than the cost of proper safety measures. He paused, wiping tears from his weathered face. But we're still here. All of us descendants, we're still here, still telling the story, still refusing to be erased. They tried to bury us, but they didn't understand. We're not just people, we're seeds. And seeds buried in dark earth have a way of growing toward the light. The Bakersville Remembrance Project, energized by the new revelations, launched a comprehensive educational initiative in 2024. They developed curriculum materials for high schools and universities, created a traveling exhibition, and established an annual scholarship program for descendants of industrial disaster victims pursuing careers in worker safety, labor law, or social justice. The exhibition, titled The Arithmetic of Exploitation, Bakersville, and the True Cost of Industrial Capitalism, opened at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in April 2024. It featured artifacts from the archaeological excavations, reproductions of the newly discovered documents, interactive displays showing the corporate structure that enabled the disaster, and video testimonies from descendants. But the most powerful element was the simplest: a wall listing every person who had lived in Bakersville. Not just the 43 who died in the disaster, but all of them. Over 400 names compiled from census fragments, church records, and family memories. Each name accompanied by whatever information could be recovered: ages, occupations, countries of origin, number of children. The message was clear. These were not statistics. These were people. They had names, families, dreams, and stories. They deserved to be remembered not as victims, but as human beings who lived and loved and struggled and deserved better than what they received. The story of Bakersville resonated far beyond America. Similar patterns of industrial exploitation and corporate erasure had occurred worldwide. In the tin mines of Bolivia, the textile factories of Bangladesh, the electronics manufacturing facilities of China. The Bakersville case provided a framework for understanding these global patterns and, more importantly, for demanding accountability. In 2024, the International Labor Organization cited Bakersville in a major report on corporate human rights violations, using it as a case study in how systematic exploitation operates across time and geography. Human rights organizations in multiple countries began excavating their own buried histories, searching for their own Bakersvilles. What emerged was a global tapestry of exploitation, each thread connecting to others, revealing a system rather than isolated incidents. The coal miners of Pennsylvania shared more than they knew with the garment workers of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, with the radium dial painters of New Jersey, with the modern-day workers in Amazon warehouses and Foxconn factories. The fundamental equation remained constant. Those who own capital make decisions about acceptable risk, and those who actually face the risk bear the consequences. But now, finally, there was a counter-movement, a global consciousness that said, enough. We remember, we document, we demand accountability. We refuse to let the dead be forgotten or the living be exploited in their name. On January 19, 2025, exactly 100 years after the disaster, a centennial memorial service was held at the Bakersville site. Thousands attended, descendants, labor activists, historians, politicians, and ordinary people who understood that this story was their story too. The youngest speaker was 7-year-old Elena Kowalski-Martinez, Thomas's great-granddaughter, representing the 5th generation since Joseph Kowalski climbed out of that flooded mine. She read a letter she had written to her great-great-great-grandfather, whom she had never met but whose photograph hung in her bedroom. Dear Grandpa Joseph, my daddy says you were very brave. My daddy says you told the truth even when people didn't want to hear it. My daddy says you never forgot the men who died, and because you didn't forget them, I know their names too. I promise I won't forget either. I promise I'll tell my children and they'll tell their children, and we'll keep telling the story forever so nobody can erase it. Again, I promise we'll keep fighting to make sure workers are safe and companies can't hurt people just to make money. Promise we'll remember that every person matters, no matter how poor they are or what language they speak or where they come from. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for surviving. Thank you for making sure we could be here. Love, Elena. There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Because that letter, written by a 7-year-old child to a great-great-great-grandfather she never met, represented the ultimate victory over erasure. The company had tried to bury Bakersville. They had demolished the buildings, scattered the people, destroyed the records, and silenced the witnesses. They had thrown money and lawyers and political power at making the town disappear. But 100 years later, thousands of people stood on that ground, saying the names of the dead, telling their stories, and promising that the fight for dignity and justice would continue. The earth remembers, the bones remember, and now irrevocably history remembers too.